The UNet is what is known as a fully convolutional neural network. These networks use convolutional layers at each step of the architecture. Convolutional layers are a trick we borrow from signal processing. Convolution is a mathematical operation of applying two functions to each other that effectively works a bit like a sliding window. Let's look at this animation of convolutions because they are so essential in modern deep learning. Here, we apply a randomized 2D weight matrix to the input data to create a transformed output. During the training, this randomized weight matrix is slowly adjusted to a filter that is more fit for the purpose of transforming said input data. In fact, we can apply convolutions in 1D, 2D, and 3D, which makes this a flexible method for all kinds of data sources like weather data. But convolutions don't necessarily change the shape of the data. Here, we can either define a step size higher than 1 for the convolution or apply a downsampling layer. These downsampling layers usually take either the mean or the maximum value of an area of the input and assign it to the resulting output point. That way, we get a smaller averaged version of the data, reducing the shape and therefore the memory footprint in the computer. However, convolutional neural networks usually increase the number of individual filters in each layer while decreasing the spatial dimension to extract information from the data. The classic UNet, for example, reduces the input image by 19 times per side, but increases the filters to 1024 at the smallest layer. Now, you may be wondering how that works. 19 versus 1000, isn't that inefficient? To the contrary, actually. The 19x reduction is applied to every data sample and dimension in the dataset of thousands, possibly millions of samples. In contrast, we save the 1000 filters in a network exactly once. The scale of deep learning makes this work. This sort of data compression plays a vital role in many neural network architectures. We call that encoder-decoder architectures since the left encodes the data to a low-dimensional representation and the decoder transforms this code layer into the output. Finally, we must look at the small connections across the U in the UNet. These have different names and they're called residual, skip, or shortcut connections. Initially, they were implemented because they improved the training on small datasets. But after further analysis, we figured out that these skip connections make the neural network training significantly easier. We'll learn more about that in the following video, but as a sneak peek, we're trying to find the lowest point on each surface. I know which one I'd want to search on. That smoothing is an effect of skip connections. When you look at ResNets, on the surface, they look nothing like UNet. But ResNets also utilize convolutional layers, pooling, and shortcuts. The architecture is simply linear instead of U-shaped. Each layer is a so-called residual block, enabling this ultra-deep architecture. These blocks consist of multiple small convolutions and a shortcut that combines the input to the block with the output, hence adding the residual to the input. Once again, these shortcuts play a role in even being able to train this network. Shortcuts contribute to solving what is known as the vanishing gradient problem, where we lose a little bit of information at every layer until eventually there is none left to adjust the neural network. Skip connections mitigate this effect by partially bypassing each layer and propagating this information. Another critical aspect introduced in the ResNet paper was applying normalization layers. To each batch of the training data we pass through the network. Mind you, we usually have to normalize our data before feeding it into a neural network anyways. Still, these so-called batch normalization layers renormalize the data within the network after they have been passed through the residual blocks. That way, even if our neural network applies substantial modifications to our data, we know the values won't explode or vanish arbitrarily. Finally, ResNets are networks that are commonly used as classifiers, so they output an integer signifying the final class prediction. We achieve this by feeding the convolutional body of the architecture into a small feed-forward network. These feed-forward networks are what you commonly see when people draw neural networks. They're these densely connected layers of nodes and edges. These networks can also be used as standalone models, but considering the interconnectedness of weather data, this is usually less applicable in numerical weather and climate prediction. Unlike the convolutional layers, where the 2D matrices share weights within a layer, we have this graph where each connection is an individual weight applied to a singular value in the input data. That's why we mostly use convolutional layers, as they're much more efficient when working with spatial data. Nevertheless, they're great final layers for classifiers and regressors that need a number output. I will skip over a deeper analysis of generative adversarial networks at this point, because these will be covered in the lessons on generative methods. But we have all the parts necessary to build these GANs. In the end, they are just clever combinations of convolutional neural networks. Oftentimes, we work with time series instead of spatial data. In that case, we often use recurrent neural networks. These networks have a feedback mechanism that takes the prior state as an additional input to processing the data. These networks are actually somewhat similar to the feed-forward network, except for that feedback loop. However, you can probably imagine that repeatedly applying these networks to a time series runs into the same problem as an ultra-deep neural network, vanishing gradients. Some people were quite clever about implementing special architectures to avoid this pitfall. Particularly, long short-term memory cells are popular because they can memorize long series of prior data to predict the subsequent outcome. Another important name here is gated recurrent unit. Diving into their specific internals would go beyond the scope of this class, but they are already implemented and readily available in all the big deep learning packages. There is a second reason I wanted to keep RNNs relatively short: transformers. These architectures address a big problem of classic RNNs in that they can take the whole input time series into context to make a prediction. Transformers utilize a special layer called attention, where they learn to prioritize certain parts of a sequence based on the input itself. This uniquely positions transformers to make predictions drawing from long-term contexts in sequences, even if they are significantly separated from the current prediction. This attention layer learns a key, a query, and a value weight matrix that works similarly to the lookup we use in databases or Python dictionaries, just much more powerful. Then we combine these attention layers with building blocks you already know. Each attention layer is followed by a feed-forward layer. These are bypassed by a skip connection to form a block. And then we stack multiple of these blocks into an encoder and a decoder. These networks have enabled the recent breakthroughs in speech-based AI, and they are equally helpful in sequences we have in weather and climate prediction. As a final treat, we'll look at graph neural networks. Anything with a connectedness inherent in the data can be modeled as a graph. This can be ocean-atmosphere coupling, or streets, or even molecules. They are useful because we connect pieces deliberately, unlike 2D maps where everything is defined by just being a neighbor to each other. However, this also poses a challenge in passing information between neighbors of our graph. One step, two step. I will link a fantastic interactive journal paper in the resources for you to dive into the details behind message passing in graph neural networks. But the neat part here is that when we solve this, we can define feed-forward and convolutional operations on graphs, bringing us back to known territory where we can build on similar architectures and building blocks as before.